The jet lurched hard enough to rattle teeth, not from turbulence, but from a sudden, violent stop, metal screaming against rubber as the brakes bit down. And in the stunned silence that followed, every head snapped toward the aisle, where a uniformed officer stood blocking the exit, one hand raised, the other already on his radio, saying quietly but clearly that no one was leaving this aircraft. Not yet. A low murmur rippled through the cabin, confusion turning sharp, and somewhere in the back a woman laughed nervously, the sound snapping off when the cabin lights dimmed a shade too low. Outside the window, dawn bled pale grey over the tarmac at Phoenix Sky Harbor, heat already rising off the concrete even though it was barely 6 in the morning, barely early enough for the retirees and consultants and old firm partners who filled this flight to San Jose to tolerate being awake. The smell of coffee hung stale and bitter. The air felt tight. In the forward cabin, Margaret Ellis sat perfectly still, hands folded over the strap of her worn leather carry-on, eyes fixed on the officer as if she were watching a distant storm roll in across flat land. 64 years old, short silver hair tucked behind her ears, sensible shoes, a navy cardigan that had seen too many airports. She did not look like trouble. She looked like someone's aunt, someone's professor, someone who had learned long ago that drawing attention only made things worse. Across the aisle, Grant Holloway exhaled loudly through his nose, a sharp sound of irritation. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking, and leaned forward just enough to be seen. "This is ridiculous," he said, not shouting, not yet, but pitched to Carrie. "We were cleared to deplane. I have a connection." Margaret felt the words land like pebbles, not aimed at her, but close enough to sting. She did not turn. She could feel his eyes anyway, the assessment, the unspoken question of why someone like her was seated where she was, why she was in the front of the plane at all. Grant Holloway was 61, real estate development, Scottsdale address, voice trained to close deals over steak dinners. His cufflinks caught the low light when he gestured, gold flashing. He had already stood once, before the officer arrived, reaching overhead as if the rules bent for men who moved fast enough. The flight attendant nearest them, a young man with a tight smile and sweat darkening the collar of his uniform, lifted both palms in a calming gesture. "Sir, please remain seated," he said, his voice cracked on please. He glanced at Margaret, then away, as if eye contact might pull him into something he did not want. From the cockpit came muffled voices, clipped and urgent, the door still closed. The officer by the exit listened to his radio, jaw set, then nodded once, slow. The words "federal hold" drifted back, quiet but heavy, the kind of phrase that made older passengers sit up straighter, because they knew it did not get thrown around without reason. Margaret breathed in through her nose, counting, the way she always did when rooms turned hostile. She could feel her pulse in her throat, steady, controlled. This was not the first time a morning had gone sideways. It would not be the last. She had learned to measure danger not by volume, but by stillness, by the moments when everyone waited for someone else to make the first wrong move. Grant shifted again, impatience leaking through his practiced calm. "This is about that bag, isn't it?" he said, to no one in particular. "I told them it was nothing. I have clearance." Margaret's fingers tightened, just a fraction. The bag. She pictured it now in the cargo hold beneath their feet. Hard case, grey, unmarked, tagged and scanned twice over because she had insisted. The argument at the gate replayed in her mind. The way the agent's smile had frozen when the system flagged the item. The way Grant had laughed under his breath and said some people loved to complicate things. At the time, she had almost apologized. Old reflex, old scar. Behind them, a woman in the second row whispered to her husband, the sound sharp in the hush. "They said Homeland Security," she murmured, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Grant heard it too. His mouth tightened. He leaned closer toward Margaret now, voice dropping, meant to sound conspiratorial. "You didn't have to escalate," he said. "You could have let it go." Margaret turned then, slow, deliberate. Her eyes were dark and steady, the kind that unsettled people because they did not flinch. "I did let it go," she said quietly. "For 20 years. The words hung between them, heavier than they should have been, and Grant scoffed, a short, dismissive sound. "I don't know what that's supposed to mean." Before she could answer, the cockpit door opened. Captain Reynolds stepped out, his face lined deeper than it had been when Margaret last saw him on a panel in Denver, eyes tired but alert. He did not look at Grant. He did not look at the other passengers craning their necks. His gaze went straight to Margaret, held for a beat too long to be coincidence. "Ms. Ellis," he said. The cabin went very quiet. Grant blinked. "Captain," he said quickly, rising halfway before the officer's hand came out, firm, stopping him. "There's been a misunderstanding. We're all late." Captain Reynolds did not break eye contact with Margaret. "I'm afraid we are not going anywhere," he said. "Not until this is resolved." Resolved was a careful word. Margaret recognized it. Legal, measured. The kind people used when they were bracing for impact. She stood, smooth and unhurried, lifting her bag from the floor. The officer shifted aside instinctively, respect flickering across his face. Grant stared now, something uneasy crawling up the back of his neck. "What is this about?" Grant demanded, the edge creeping in despite himself. Margaret faced the aisle, the plane, the eyes watching her with a mix of curiosity and irritation, and something like fear. Her voice was calm, controlled. "It's about a shipment that should never have been rushed," she said. "It's about a clearance that was never finalized. And it's about a decision someone made because they thought speed mattered more than safety." Grant laughed, sharp and brittle. "You can't ground a flight over paperwork." Captain Reynolds inhaled slowly. "Sir," he said, and now he looked at Grant, really looked, with the flat authority of someone who had buried friends because of small mistakes. "This aircraft is already grounded." The word hit like a dropped plate. Margaret felt it settle in her chest, the weight of inevitability. Outside, another vehicle rolled up, lights flashing but no siren, men and women stepping out with badges that caught the rising sun. She knew them, not personally but professionally. The kind of people who showed up when things had already gone wrong, and someone needed to decide how much worse it was going to get. Grant's face drained of color. "This is insane," he said. "Do you know who I am?" Margaret met his eyes one last time. There was no triumph there, only resolve, and something older. "Yes," she said. "And that's the problem." Behind her, the officer spoke softly into his radio, confirming positions, timelines, procedures. The cabin buzzed low now, tension humming like live wire. Margaret stepped into the aisle, toward the waiting light at the door, toward the moment she could no longer delay. She had spent a lifetime being underestimated. Today, she was done carrying other people's risks. And the flight was only just beginning. The jet bridge door sealed with a hollow thud, a sound too final for something meant to be temporary. And the cabin exhaled all at once. A collective release that did nothing to ease the tension. Outside, the flashing lights reflected off the fuselage in slow pulses, blue and amber washing through the oval windows like distant lightning. The engines were silent now. No hum, no vibration, just the faint click of cooling metal. Margaret Ellis stood at the front of the aisle beside Captain Reynolds, her posture straight but unassuming, hands resting lightly at her sides. From this angle, she could see every face in first class, each one registering a different stage of disbelief. Some leaned forward, hungry for explanation, Others folded their arms, defensive, already preparing complaints. A few avoided her gaze entirely, staring at their laps as if none of this involved them. Grant Holloway sat rigid in his seat, one hand gripping the armrest hard enough to blanch his knuckles. He watched Margaret the way men watched doors closing, calculating whether there was still time to slip through before the lock engaged. His mind raced ahead to calls he would make, favors he would pull, names he would drop. He had spent decades building a life where problems were temporary and consequences negotiable. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice steady, trained to cut through panic without inflaming it. "We are currently under a federal safety hold. This is not a mechanical failure. This is a compliance matter. I need everyone to remain seated and follow crew instructions." A ripple of protest rose, muted but sharp. A man 2 rows back muttered something about taxpayer money. A woman whispered that she was going to miss her granddaughter's recital. Margaret absorbed it all without reacting. She had learned long ago that people aimed their fear at the nearest object that looked solid. The forward door opened again, slower this time, and 2 agents stepped inside. Not uniformed police. Dark jackets, badges clipped but not flaunted. Calm, deliberate movements. The kind of people who did not need to announce authority because they carried it quietly. One was a woman in her 40s, hair pulled back tight, eyes scanning the cabin with clinical focus. The other, older, grey at the temples, took in the scene like a chessboard. The female agent approached Captain Reynolds first, exchanging a few low words Margaret could not hear. Then her gaze shifted, landing on Margaret with instant recognition. She nodded once, small, respectful. "Ms. Ellis," the agent said, "we need to speak with you." Grant's head snapped up. "Speak with her about what?" he demanded, the veneer cracking. "This is my flight too." The agent turned to him slowly. "Sir," she said, tone neutral, "we'll get to you shortly." Shortly was a dangerous word. Grant could hear it. He leaned forward, pointing toward Margaret. "This is absurd," he said. "She doesn't get to hold a plane hostage because she panicked over a shipment." Margaret finally spoke, her voice low but carrying. "I didn't panic," she said. "I followed protocol." The older agent raised an eyebrow, interested now. "Protocol," he echoed. Margaret met his eyes. "Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 192, she said. "Data integrity and safety reporting. When a system certified under federal compliance flags an unresolved risk, it has to be reported immediately. No discretion." A hush fell. Not because everyone understood the regulation, but because they understood certainty when they heard it. Grant laughed, sharp and hollow. "You expect us to believe you know FAA code off the top of your head?" Margaret looked at him, not unkindly. "I helped write the revisions after the Midwest incident," she said. "The one where they lost 3 people because someone assumed a delay wasn't worth the paperwork." The words Midwest incident traveled through the cabin like an electric current. Older passengers remembered. They always did. The news footage, the hearings, the slow, careful language that followed to explain why something preventable had been allowed to happen. The female agent glanced at her partner. "She's correct," she said quietly. Grant's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, doubt flickered through his anger. Captain Reynolds stepped aside as the agents moved down the aisle. The older agent stopped beside Grant's row, eyes dropping to the floor near his feet, then lifting to the overhead bin above him. "Mr. Holloway," he said, reading from a tablet. "You checked a hard case under expedited clearance this morning." Grant straightened, defensive instinct flaring. "I've done it dozens of times," he snapped. "I have a standing exemption." "You did," the agent replied. "It expired last quarter." The air seemed to thin. Grant swallowed. That's impossible. It's not, Margaret said softly. You were notified. Twice. Once by mail, once digitally. Grant turned on her, rage flashing hot and sudden. You went digging! No, she said. My system flagged it. The female agent nodded. Aerosure flagged the discrepancy when the clearance code didn't reconcile with the manifest, she said. That system belongs to Aerolink. Eyes shifted. Heads turned. The name landed with weight now, context snapping into place. Grant's face drained further. You run that company, he said slowly, the realization crawling in. You're Ellis. Margaret did not correct him. She did not confirm. She simply stood there, letting the truth settle without theatrics. The older agent closed his tablet. Mr. Holloway, he said, we're going to need you to step off the aircraft for questioning. Grant surged to his feet. This is harassment, he barked. I have rights. You do, the agent agreed. And we're respecting them, right now. The officer at the door stepped forward, blocking Grant's path. Around them, the cabin buzzed, phones discreetly lifted, whispers spilling despite attempts at restraint. Someone in the back whispered her name. Ellis. Someone else pulled up a news article, eyes widening. Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, but memory. Boardrooms where men had talked over her. Hearings where her expertise had been questioned because of the voice delivering it. She had learned to wait, to let systems reveal what people refused to see. Grant looked around, searching for an ally, for someone to validate his outrage. No one met his eyes. As the agents guided him into the aisle, his composure finally broke. You did this, he hissed at Margaret as he passed, voice shaking. You could have warned me. Margaret met his gaze, steady. I did, she said. You just didn't listen. The jet bridge door opened again, letting in the dry Arizona heat and the glare of morning. Grant disappeared into it, his protests fading into the clatter of voices beyond. The door closed behind him with another final thud. Silence followed. Heavy. Expectant. Captain Reynolds turned back to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, thank you for your patience. We will provide updates as soon as we are cleared. Margaret remained standing a moment longer, feeling the weight of eyes on her. Then she bent, lifted her bag, and slid back into her seat. Around her, conversations resumed in low, altered tones. Nothing would be the same now. It never was after truth surfaced. Outside, the flashing lights dimmed. Inside, the flight remained grounded. And the real consequences were only beginning. The cabin stayed grounded longer than anyone expected. Not minutes, but stretches of time that felt elastic, pulling nerves thin. The air conditioning kicked back on at half strength, enough to keep the heat from becoming a threat, but not enough to be comfortable. Sweat gathered at collars. Jackets came off. The plane felt smaller now, compressed by waiting. Margaret Ellis sat with her hands folded again, eyes forward, posture unchanged. From the outside, she looked calm. Inside, old memories stirred. Not panic, not doubt, but a familiar weight. She had stood in rooms like this before. Not airplanes, but boardrooms, hearing the low murmur of people recalculating their assumptions in real time. It always sounded the same. Chairs shifting, throats clearing, the soft rustle of paper as someone pretended to be busy. Across the aisle, the seat Grant Holloway had occupied sat empty, belt unfastened, screen dark. It was an absence that drew attention, like a missing tooth in a smile. People kept glancing at it, then at Margaret, then quickly away, as if looking too long might implicate them. The young flight attendant returned with a tray of water cups, his movements careful now, overly polite. He paused beside Margaret. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "Can I get you anything else?" Margaret looked up at him, really looked. His eyes were wide, unsettled. He was trying to do everything right now, desperate not to misstep. She softened her voice. "Water is fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded too many times and moved on. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds sat forward, headset pressed tight, listening as voices flowed in from operations, legal, compliance. He had flown combat missions in his 20s, cargo runs through bad weather in his 30s, passenger routes for decades after. He knew fear. He knew danger. This was something else. This was consequence unfolding by procedure, slow and unavoidable. "They're reviewing the clearance history," came a voice through his headset. "Timeline suggests a lapse that predates today." Reynolds closed his eyes for half a second. "So this isn't isolated?" "No, Captain. And because the alert came from Airline, it triggered an automatic cross-check with federal records. We can't override that." Reynolds exhaled slowly. He glanced back through the cockpit door window at the cabin, at the silver-haired woman seated near the front, spine straight, eyes forward. He had flown long enough to know when he was in the presence of someone who did not bluff. In the cabin, whispers sharpened into speculation. A man near the window leaned toward his seatmate, voice low. "You know who she is, right?" The other man shook his head. "No idea. She testified before Congress a few years back. Transportation Committee. Data safety." "That was her." "Yeah, same woman." The name moved again, faster this time. No longer just Ellis, but Margaret Ellis. The sound of it clicking into place for people who followed hearings, who read newspapers the way others read stock tickers. Older passengers straightened, recognition dawning. Not awe, not worship. Something closer to respect, earned slowly over time. Margaret felt the shift without turning. She had always been sensitive to rooms, to energy. She knew when attention changed from hostile to cautious. She did not enjoy it. It was simply another phase. The female agent returned from the front of the plane, posture relaxed but alert. She stopped beside Margaret's row. "Ms. Ellis," she said quietly, "Operations would like to speak with you directly." Margaret nodded once and stood. The movement drew eyes again, but now there was less judgment in them, more curiosity, a sense that something larger was taking shape. They moved toward the front galley, the agent walking beside her rather than ahead, a subtle but meaningful difference. In the narrow space, voices dropped lower. "This may take longer than anticipated," the agent said. "Once federal review starts, it doesn't stop easily." Margaret met her gaze. "I know. You could request an exemption," the agent offered. "Given your position." Margaret shook her head. "Then it would mean nothing." The agent studied her for a moment, then nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing her face. Understood. From the cabin, someone raised a voice. "So, are we missing our flights because of a paperwork issue?" a man demanded, frustration boiling over now that time had stretched. "Is that what this is?" Captain Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit again, standing tall, hands relaxed at his sides. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried authority without aggression. "This delay is about safety compliance, not convenience. We will move as soon as we are legally cleared." A woman near the aisle scoffed. "That's always what they say." Margaret turned then, meeting the woman's gaze across the space. She did not raise her voice. She did not posture. "Sometimes," she said calmly, "what they say is exactly what they mean." The woman hesitated, then looked away, chastened by the quiet certainty in the words. In the galley, the older agent returned, tablet in hand. "Ms. Ellis," he said, "there's more." Margaret inclined her head. "There usually is." "We've confirmed the clearance lapse wasn't just administrative," he continued. "There's evidence it was knowingly bypassed. Repeatedly." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. This was the part she had hoped would not surface. though she had suspected it. "Then it isn't just on him," she said. "No," the agent agreed. "It's systemic." The word landed heavy. Systemic. Margaret felt a familiar anger stir, controlled but sharp. This was why she had built what she had built. Not for power, not for prestige, but because systems failed quietly until someone forced them to speak. Back in the cabin, the absence of Grant Holloway had become symbolic. He was no longer the story. He was the entry point. People sensed it now, the way animals sensed weather change. This was not about one man losing his temper. This was about a pattern being exposed. A man in the second row leaned into the aisle, voice respectful now. "Ma'am," he called softly, "is it true this could affect other flights?" Margaret turned, considering him. She could lie. She could soften it. She chose neither. "If the same shortcuts were taken elsewhere," she said, "then yes." A murmur followed. Not anger this time. Concern. The kind that came from people who had lived long enough to understand that small compromises accumulated. Captain Reynolds returned to the cockpit, jaw set. "We're not going anywhere until they finish," he said into his headset. "And frankly, I don't want to." Margaret returned to her seat slowly, the aisle opening for her without instruction. She sat, feeling the plane settle around her, suspended between motion and stillness. Outside, another aircraft taxied past, lifting off into the pale sky, free. Inside, this flight remained grounded, not because of failure, but because someone had finally refused to look away. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, breathing evenly. The reveal had begun, not with a declaration, not with a title, but with consequence. And soon, whether anyone liked it or not, the full truth would have to surface. There was no going back now. The announcement came without ceremony. No chime, no scripted apology. Just Captain Reynolds' voice again, quieter this time, stripped of performance. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received confirmation from operations. This aircraft will remain grounded until further notice." That did it. A man near the bulkhead let out a sharp laugh, brittle, disbelieving. Someone else swore under their breath. A phone rang and was silenced too late. The tension tipped, spilling over into something heavier than frustration. People weren't just inconvenienced now. They were trapped in uncertainty. The one thing this cabin of planners and veterans and retired executives hated most. Margaret Ellis felt it shift. The air changed. When control is removed, people look for someone to blame. The woman who had scoffed earlier stood up, despite the attendant's raised hand. "This is insane," she said, voice trembling with anger. "We did everything right. We bought it. We paid. Why are we being punished because of one issue with cargo?" Several heads nodded. Agreement spread fast when it had somewhere to land. Margaret stayed seated. She knew this moment. The crowd turning, searching for a face to attach their anger to. She had been that face before. Captain Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret stood before he could. Not abruptly, not dramatically. She rose the way people did when they had already decided something and were finished negotiating with themselves. "I understand why you're upset," she said. Her voice didn't fight the noise. It slipped through it. "You have plans, people waiting for you, lives that don't pause just because a flight does." The woman hesitated, caught off guard by the lack of defensiveness. Margaret continued, "But no one here is being punished. What's happening right now is the system doing what it was designed to do. Stopping, asking questions, refusing to move forward when the answers don't line up." A man near the window snorted. "That's easy to say when you're not missing anything important." Margaret turned toward him. She met his eyes, held them. "I've missed funerals," she said evenly. "I've missed surgeries. I've missed moments I will never get back, because someone, somewhere, decided a rule was optional. The cabin went quiet again. Not stunned silence this time. Listening silence. She took a breath, steadying. This wasn't the reveal yet, not fully, but it was close enough that she could feel it pressing against her ribs. We all trust these machines with our lives, she said, every time we board. That trust is built on thousands of small decisions made correctly, one at a time. When someone shortcuts one of them, it doesn't matter how minor it seems. It matters that it happened. The woman slowly sat back down. The anger didn't vanish, but it lost its target. Behind Margaret, Captain Reynolds watched her with a new expression. Not relief, respect. The kind pilots reserved for people who understood risk without romanticizing it. From the galley, Karen Whitmore stood frozen, hands clenched around the edge of the counter. Her face had gone pale hours ago, but now something else crept in beneath the fear. Recognition. She replayed the morning in her head, the way she had waved Margaret aside, the way she had trusted Grant's confidence over documentation, because it felt familiar. Because it felt safe. She had been wrong. Karen swallowed and stepped forward, voice shaking but audible. "This is on us," she said. Heads turned. "On the crew. On the process. We should have stopped it sooner." Margaret turned slowly. Their eyes met. Karen's were wet now, not performative, not begging, just stripped bare. Margaret held the gaze a moment longer than necessary. Then she nodded once. Not forgiveness. Acknowledgement. In the cockpit, a new voice crackled through the speakers. Sharper, more formal. Legal, compliance. Words like audit trail and chain of authorization floated back. Unmistakable now. The shape of the problem was emerging, and it was bigger than a single flight. Captain Reynolds stepped forward again. "Thank you, Ms. Ennis," he said quietly, using her name without ceremony. "We'll take it from here." Margaret returned to her seat, heart steady, spine straight. She could feel eyes on her again, but they were different now. No longer dismissive, no longer hostile. Curious, measuring. Someone whispered behind her, "Do you think she's with the FAA?" "No," someone else murmured. "She's worse." Margaret allowed herself the smallest exhale. Outside, the sun climbed higher, washing the tarmac in white light. Planes continued to take off and land around them, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. Inside this cabin, time had slowed, coiling tight. The climax was coming. She could feel it. Not a speech, not a confrontation. A reckoning, delivered the only way systems ever truly changed. By documentation. By record. By consequences that couldn't be argued away. And when it came, no one on this plane would forget where they were when the flight stopped moving. The call came through the cabin speakers this time, not as an announcement, but as a clipped exchange that bled out of the cockpit before anyone could stop it. A voice from operations, tight and professional, asking for confirmation. Captain Reynolds answering with a single word. Confirmed. Margaret Ellis felt it then, the shift she had been waiting for. Not the anger, not the fear, the recognition. The moment when the story stopped being about inconvenience and started becoming about responsibility. Karen Whitmore stood rigid in the galley, fingers white against the counter. She had replayed the boarding sequence so many times in her head that the images were starting to blur. The moment she had glanced at Grant Holloway's watch, the ease of his confidence, the way she had felt relief choosing the path of least resistance. Now that relief curdled into something heavier. Regret had weight. It sat in her chest, pressing down with every breath. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing just behind Margaret's row. "Ms. Ellis," she said quietly. Margaret turned. Karen flinched, expecting anger. She didn't get it. She got assessment. Measured. Careful. "I need to say this," Karen continued, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "I treated your concern like a delay instead of a warning. I thought I was keeping things smooth. I wasn't." Margaret studied her face. The lines around Karen's eyes, the tension in her jaw. This was not a performance. This was a woman realizing the cost of a shortcut. "Thank you for saying that," Margaret replied. Her voice was calm, but not soft. "What matters now is what you do with it." Karen nodded, swallowing hard. She stepped back, retreating into the galley like someone who had just been handed a verdict. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds listened as legal ran through the implications. The clearance lapse wasn't a one-off. It had been overridden manually more than once. The same signature, the same rationale. Expediency, customer priority. Words that sounded harmless until they weren't. "So what are we looking at?" Reynolds asked. "At minimum," came the reply, "a full internal review. Potential federal oversight. Depending on how far this goes, it could affect multiple routes." Reynolds closed his eyes briefly. He thought of the passengers behind him, thought of the trust they placed in aluminum and code and human judgment. "Then we're staying right where we are," he said. Back in the cabin, the mood had changed again. Conversations dropped to whispers, not because people were being told to be quiet, but because something instinctive told them this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was consequence. A man across the aisle leaned toward Margaret, his voice respectful now. "Ma'am," he said, "are we safe?" Margaret met his gaze. She did not rush the answer. "Yes," she said. "That's why we're still here." He nodded slowly, absorbing it, then leaned back in his seat. Phones buzzed discreetly. Messages went out. Meetings were rescheduled. Lives adjusted. Not gracefully, not without resentment, but inevitably. The flight had stopped being a means to an end. It had become a pause no one could bypass. Outside the window, a maintenance truck rolled past, its reflection rippling across the glass. Margaret watched it without really seeing it. Her mind was already moving ahead, mapping the fallout. Reports, hearings, questions she would be asked, and answers she would have to give without flinching. She thought of the years it had taken to build Aerolink, the nights sleeping in offices, the rooms where she had been the only woman, the only black face, the only one insisting that compliance wasn't bureaucracy, it was protection. She had been called difficult, obsessive, slow. Now the plane sat motionless because she had refused to be any other way. A chime finally sounded, gentle but firm. Captain Reynolds' voice followed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're coordinating accommodations and rebooking options. Please remain seated while our crew assists." A wave of resigned motion passed through the cabin. People stood, stretched, gathered bags. The tension didn't disappear, but it loosened, reshaping into something more manageable. Acceptance. Karen Whitmore moved down the aisle with purpose now, directing, assisting, apologizing where needed. When she reached Margaret again, she stopped. "Your connection," she said. "We'll make sure it's protected." Margaret shook her head slightly. "It can wait." Karen hesitated, then nodded, something like relief flickering across her face. The agents returned one last time, speaking quietly with Captain Reynolds before approaching Margaret. "Ms. Ellis," the female agent said, "we'll be in touch. There will be follow-up." Margaret inclined her head. "I expect there will." As the agents left, the cabin began to empty in stages. The seat beside Margaret remained unoccupied, a silent reminder of the man who had once filled it with certainty. She watched passengers pass her now, some nodding, some murmuring thanks, others saying nothing at all. She did not require acknowledgement. The system did. When the cabin was nearly clear, Captain Reynolds approached her, removing his cap. "I've flown for a long time," he said. "Not many people are willing to be the reason a plane doesn't move." Margaret smiled faintly. "Most people think stopping is failure," she said. "Sometimes it's the only responsible choice." He nodded. "I'd fly with you any time." She stood, lifting her bag, feeling the weight of the moment settle behind her like a door closing. As she stepped off the aircraft into the bright morning, she knew the story would spread. It always did. Simplified, sensationalized, stripped of nuance. But the record would remain. The paperwork, the audit trail, the reason a flight had been grounded because one woman refused to ignore what everyone else was willing to overlook. And somewhere down the line, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, another plane would take off safer because of it. By late afternoon, the airport had returned to its usual rhythm, departures blinking back onto schedule boards, rolling announcements dissolving into background noise, the incident already being folded into the quiet machinery of operations. But for Margaret Ennis, the day was far from over. She sat alone in a small conference room off the main terminal, the kind with frosted glass walls and a table bolted to the floor, a paper cup of coffee untouched in front of her. The hum of air conditioning filled the silence. Outside, silhouettes moved past the glass, indistinct, anonymous. Inside, time slowed again. Across from her sat two airline executives and a representative from Federal Compliance. No raised voices, no theatrics, just documents laid out carefully, tablets glowing with timelines, logs, authorization chains. This was where real consequences lived. Not on the plane, not in the aisle. Here. "We've confirmed the override originated from a senior operations supervisor," the compliance officer said, tapping the screen. "Not Mr. Holloway directly." Margaret nodded. She had expected that. Systems like this rarely broke at the surface. "But he benefited from it," she said evenly. "And he knew the clearance wasn't valid." "Yes," the officer replied. "That much is clear." One of the airline executives, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a careful voice, leaned forward. "Dr. Ellis," he said, using the title now deliberately. "We want to be very clear. We are not trying to minimize what happened." Margaret met his gaze. "Then don't," she said. Not sharp, not loud, just final. He swallowed and continued. "Aerolink's alert forced us to stop. That likely prevented a larger issue. For that, we're grateful." Grateful was a word people used when they were cornered by facts. Margaret let it pass. "What happens next?" she asked. The compliance officer answered. "Mandatory audit. Full review of expedited clearance practices. Retraining. Possible sanctions. We'll also be issuing a directive to other carriers using similar systems." Margaret felt a tightness ease in her chest, just slightly. Not satisfaction. Something closer to alignment. This was what the system was supposed to do when it worked. A knock sounded at the door. Karen Whitmore stepped in, hesitantly, uniform jacket folded over her arm. Her face looked older than it had that morning. Lines deeper, eyes clearer. "I was told you were here," Karen said, voice low. "I didn't want to interrupt." The airline executive glanced at Margaret. She nodded once. Karen entered fully, closing the door behind her. "I've been placed on administrative leave," Karen said. She didn't sound surprised. "There's an investigation." Margaret studied her, noting the lack of defensiveness, the absence of self-pity. "How do you feel about that?" she asked. Karen exhaled slowly. "Like it's deserved," she said. "And overdue." Silence settled, thick but not hostile. I spent years telling myself I was good at my job because I kept things moving, Karen continued. Today showed me what that cost. She hesitated, then met Margaret's eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I just didn't want to leave without saying, I understand now. Margaret held her gaze. She thought of the hundreds of Karens she had encountered over a lifetime, not all cruel, not all malicious, but comfortable enough in systems that favored them to stop questioning those systems. Change rarely came from shaming. It came from interruption. Understanding is a beginning, Margaret said. What you do with it is what matters. Karen nodded, tears bright but contained. I won't waste it. She left quietly. The compliance officer gathered his materials. We'll be in touch, he said. Your testimony may be requested. Margaret nodded. I'll be available. When the room finally emptied, Margaret sat alone again, the coffee long cold. She didn't move for a moment. She listened to the building, the distant echo of luggage wheels, the low rumble of jets overhead. Life continuing. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant, concise as always. Media inquiries increasing. Congressional staff requesting comment. Board members checking in. She typed a brief reply. Hold statements. Provide documentation only. As she stood to leave, catching her reflection in the glass, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she had changed, but because the world around her finally had. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in muted gold. Another flight roared overhead, climbing, steady. Margaret watched it for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. The plane she had boarded that morning never took off, but something else had, and it would not be easy to land. By evening, the story had escaped the airport. Margaret Ellis felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift in how people moved around her as she walked through the terminal toward the exit. Conversations cut short. Eyes lingered a second too long. Phones angled just enough to catch her profile without being obvious. The machinery of attention had engaged, slow at first, then accelerating. Outside, the desert heat finally began to loosen its grip. The sky over Phoenix stretched wide and bruised purple, the sun sinking behind concrete and glass. Margaret paused near the curb, letting the automatic doors slide shut behind her, sealing off the noise of the terminal. She stood there for a moment, breathing in air that smelled faintly of jet fuel and dust, grounding herself in something physical. Her phone vibrated again. This time, she didn't ignore it. The screen lit with a single notification, not from media, not from the board, but from an unfamiliar number routed through a secure channel. She answered without speaking. Dr. Ellis, a man's voice said, calm, measured. This is Thomas Riley, Transportation Oversight Subcommittee. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Of course it had reached them already. It always did when systems stalled publicly. Good evening, she said. We wanted you to hear this directly, Riley continued. There will be questions, formal ones, not accusations. Clarifications. Margaret almost smiled. I welcome them. A pause, then quieter. You're aware this will reopen several dormant cases? I am, she replied. That's why the protocol exists. Another pause, heavier this time. Some people won't appreciate that. They rarely do, Margaret said. The line went dead. She slipped the phone back into her bag and stepped into the waiting car, a simple black sedan arranged by airport services when it became clear she wouldn't be flying anywhere tonight. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, recognition flickering, but said nothing. She appreciated that. As the car pulled away, Margaret watched the terminal recede, lights blurring into streaks. Her mind moved ahead, not racing, but mapping. She thought of the first version of the Aerolink alert system, How rudimentary it had been. How often she had been told it was unnecessary, redundant, too conservative. She remembered the meeting where a senior executive had laughed and asked if she planned to ground every flight in America. She hadn't answered then. She had just kept building. At a red light, the driver's phone buzzed. He glanced down, then back up at the road. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "they're talking about you on the news." Margaret nodded once. "They will." By the time she reached the hotel, the lobby televisions were already looping footage of the grounded aircraft, commentators filling the silence with speculation. Margaret walked past them without stopping, the sound washing over her like static. She took the elevator alone, rode it up in quiet. In her room, she set her bag down and removed her shoes, the simple act grounding her again. She stood by the window, looking out over the city, lights scattered like constellations. Somewhere below, people hurried to dinner, to meetings, to lives uninterrupted by audits and holds. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from her daughter. "Saw the headlines. Are you okay?" Margaret typed back slowly. "I am. I'll explain tomorrow." She set the phone aside and let herself sit. Really sit, for the first time all day. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind a deep, bone-level fatigue. This was the cost no one saw. The quiet after. The hours when you replay every decision, not to doubt them, but to prepare for what came next. Down the hall, another door opened and closed. Somewhere, laughter echoed briefly, then faded. Life went on. Across town, in a different hotel, Grant Holloway sat alone on the edge of his bed, tie loosened, jacket discarded. His phone lay face up on the desk, screen lighting again and again with messages he did not open. He stared at the wall, the events of the day replaying in fragments. The officer's hand, the way the captain hadn't looked at him, the calm in Margaret's voice when she said she had warned him. He had always believed rules were flexible if you knew the right people. That confidence had been his currency. Today, it had evaporated. He picked up his phone finally, scrolling through headlines, each one sharpening the truth he didn't want to accept. This wasn't going away. It was expanding, and for the first time in decades, there was no one he could call to make it stop. Back in her room, Margaret lay down without turning on the lights. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the muted sounds of the city through the glass. Tomorrow would bring interviews, statements, hearings. People would argue about intent, about proportionality, about whether a delay justified the fallout. She knew how those conversations went. But tonight, in the stillness, she allowed herself one quiet certainty. Whatever came next, the system had done what it was meant to do. It had stopped. It had forced a question. And once a question was asked at that scale, it could never be unasked. Margaret closed her eyes, the image of the motionless plane settling into memory, not as a symbol of disruption, but of restraint. Somewhere, far above the city, another aircraft cut through the dark, lights blinking steadily, guided by code and checks, and people who believed stopping was sometimes the bravest choice. Tomorrow, the story would grow larger than her. But tonight, she rested, knowing she had already done the hardest part. Morning came quietly, the kind that slipped in without asking permission. Pale light filtered through the hotel curtains, touching the edge of the desk, the back of the chair, the legal pad Margaret Ellis had left untouched the night before. She lay still for a moment, listening to the city wake up. Sirens in the distance. A truck downshifting at an intersection. Somewhere, a plane lifting off, its low roar rolling through the glass and into her chest. She sat up slowly, joints protesting the way they always did now, a reminder of time earned, not lost. The phone on the nightstand vibrated before she could reach for it. Not a call. A briefing packet. Secure. Overnight. She scanned it, standing by the window, reading without reacting. Headlines, internal memos, a preliminary notice from the airline acknowledging a compliance failure. A request from 2 other carriers asking for clarification on their own expedited clearance logs. The ripple had started. Not chaos. Alignment. Systems waking up to themselves. In a studio across town, a television anchor rehearsed her opening line, while a producer counted down with raised fingers. On the screen behind them, a still image of the grounded plane filled the frame, the caption beneath it careful, restrained. Federal Safety Review halts morning flight. No name yet. Not hers, not his. Just the fact. Margaret dressed simply. Dark slacks, a pressed white blouse, the same navy cardigan. No jewelry beyond her watch. She did not dress for cameras. She dressed for rooms where words mattered more than appearances. Down in the lobby, a few heads turned as she crossed toward the coffee station. A man near the elevators paused mid-sentence. A woman lowered her phone. Margaret poured herself a cup, added cream, stirred once. The normalcy steadied her. A voice behind her cleared its throat. Dr. Ellis. She turned. A man about her age stood there, posture straight, suit well worn, eyes sharp with recognition. "I served on the transportation committee," he said. "Retired now." She nodded. "Good morning." "I watched you testify," he continued. "Years ago, about data redundancy." Margaret remembered that room, the microphones, the skepticism. "That was a long time ago." He smiled faintly. "You didn't bend then either." She accepted the quiet compliment without comment. He hesitated, then extended his hand. She shook it, firm, brief. When he walked away, she felt something unexpected settle in her chest. Not pride, continuity. Outside, a car waited to take her to the airline's regional headquarters. The driver said her name without question. Inside the car, the city slid by, glass and concrete catching the morning sun. Margaret watched reflections shift across the windshield, thinking not of the day ahead, but of the years behind it. Of all the times she had been told to compromise, to wait, to choose a quieter hill to stand on. At the headquarters, the room was already full when she arrived. Legal counsel, operations, compliance. Faces tight with fatigue, some with defensiveness, others with relief. A large screen at the front displayed timelines and flowcharts, boxes and arrows mapping the shortcuts that had seemed harmless until they weren't. Margaret took her seat without ceremony. The meeting began. Words like exposure and mitigation floated through the air. Someone suggested emphasizing customer inconvenience in public statements. Someone else argued for transparency. Margaret listened, hands folded, eyes steady. When there was a pause, she spoke. "This isn't about inconvenience," she said. The room quieted. "It's about pattern. You don't fix a pattern by apologizing for the moment it's noticed. You fix it by admitting why it was allowed to exist." A man at the far end shifted uncomfortably. "With respect," he said, "this could cost the company millions." Margaret met his gaze. "It already has," she replied. "You just haven't accounted for the cost of not stopping." Silence followed. Not resistance, processing. In another building across town, Grant Holloway sat in a conference room that felt suddenly smaller than it had the day before. A lawyer spoke, outlining options, none of them good. Grant barely listened. His attention snagged on a line in a news article pulled up on his tablet. The system worked as designed. He closed the screen, jaw tight. He had built his life on workarounds, on exceptions, on being the person the rules quietly stepped aside for. Now he was discovering what happened when they didn't. Back at headquarters, the meeting broke for a brief recess. Margaret stood by the window, looking down at the parking lot. cars moving in clean, orderly lines. Systems, she thought. Visible ones were easier. Her phone buzzed, a message from her daughter again. "They're calling you a whistleblower." Margaret typed back. "I was never quiet." She slipped the phone away as the meeting reconvened. The decisions made in this room would echo outward, shaping policies, retraining programs, new safeguards. None of it dramatic, none of it fast. Real change rarely was. As the morning wore on, the narrative began to settle. Not outrage, not spectacle. Accountability. The kind that didn't burn hot and fast, but pressed down steadily until something shifted for good. Margaret felt tired, deeply so. But beneath it was something solid. Purpose, reaffirmed. She had not set out to stop a flight. She had set out to stop a habit. And habits, once interrupted, had a way of unraveling. When the meeting finally adjourned, she gathered her things and stepped back into the sunlight. The day was fully awake now. Somewhere above her, another plane crossed the sky. On time, unremarkable, safe. She watched it for a moment, then turned and walked forward, already thinking about the next room she would have to enter, the next system that would need to be reminded why the rules existed in the first place. This was only Chapter 8. The story was still climbing. The first subpoena arrived just after noon. Margaret Ellis was walking through the glass corridor between buildings when her phone buzzed, a vibration sharper than the rest, the kind reserved for messages that mattered. She stopped mid-step, sunlight cutting across the floor in long, pale lines, and read the header without opening the attachment. Joint Oversight Hearing, Transportation and Commerce. She did not sigh. She did not smile. She simply nodded once, to no one, the way people do when a long-anticipated storm finally breaks the horizon. Inside the next conference room, the tone had shifted again. The urgency was no longer defensive. It was surgical. Whiteboards filled with timelines, compliance officers speaking in measured phrases, lawyers no longer asking how to minimize exposure, but how to survive transparency. One man near the end of the table leaned back, rubbing his temples. "This is going to change how the entire industry handles expedited clearance," he said, half warning, half realization. Margaret took her seat. "It should," she replied. Across the country, the story hardened into something the networks could no longer soften. No longer a stranded flight, no longer an inconvenience. Analysts pulled historical data. Retired inspectors were invited on air. Phrases like procedural drift and normalization of deviation entered the conversation. Slow, heavy words that didn't trend quickly, but stayed. In living rooms and diners and union halls, older Americans leaned closer to their screens. They recognized the pattern. They had lived through bridges that collapsed, reactors that failed, disasters that had been preceded by quiet warnings no one wanted to hear. This time, the warning had been impossible to ignore. At a satellite office in Northern California, Aerolink engineers gathered around a long table, eyes glued to a shared display. Log entries scrolled by, timestamps lining up like footprints in wet cement. A younger engineer broke the silence. "She warned them," he said, "years ago." An older woman across from him nodded. "She always does." Margaret's phone lit up again. This time, it was a secure video request. She accepted it without hesitation. The screen filled with a familiar face, gray hair, calm eyes, the chairwoman of the Federal Transportation Safety Board. They had sparred before, respected each other. Neither wasted time. "You didn't cause this," the chairwoman said. Margaret held her gaze. "I know. But you forced it into the open." "Yes." A pause. Then, "We're convening a closed session tonight. We want you there." Margaret exhaled slowly. "I'll be there." When the call ended, she remained seated, hands resting flat on the table, grounding herself. This was the moment before the reveal, the breath drawn before the truth was spoken aloud, in rooms where it could no longer be dismissed as opinion. Not whistleblower, not agitator. Architect. The architect of a system designed to stop when people wouldn't. Elsewhere, Grant Holloway watched the same coverage from a dim office, blinds half drawn, the sound turned low. His name wasn't on the screen, not yet, but he felt it approaching. He had spoken to 3 lawyers that morning. None of them sounded optimistic. One of them had said it plainly. This isn't about what you did. It's about what you represent. Grant stared at his reflection in the darkened glass, barely recognizing the man looking back. For the first time, he understood he was not the villain of a story. He was evidence. As evening crept in, Margaret stepped into the black sedan waiting outside the building. The city glowed amber, traffic humming, life moving forward, unaware of how close it had come to continuing the wrong way. She watched the lights pass, feeling the weight of what was about to happen settle into place. Tomorrow, her name would be spoken in rooms that shaped policy. Her work would be dissected, challenged, validated. The reveal would not come with applause or outrage, but with record, with testimony, with the quiet shift of precedent. The plane had been grounded. Now the industry was bracing to move differently. Margaret closed her eyes as the car merged into traffic, steady, controlled, unhurried. The final climb was beginning. The hearing room was colder than it needed to be, the kind of deliberate chill meant to keep voices steady and tempers contained. And as Margaret Ellis took her seat at the long oak table, she felt the weight of decades settle into her spine. Not as fatigue, but as gravity. Cameras lined the back wall, quiet now, red lights dark, waiting. Staffers moved with practiced efficiency, passing folders, whispering timelines, adjusting microphones by fractions of an inch. Above it all, the seal of the United States hung heavy, reminding everyone present that this was not theater. This was record. Across from her sat men and women she had known for years. Some had dismissed her early warnings as excessive. Some had quietly relied on her systems while publicly downplaying their importance. A few had stood beside her when it was easier to sit somewhere else. Their faces gave nothing away now. Professional neutrality was the uniform of the room. When the chairwoman called the session to order, her voice cut cleanly through the low hum, and Margaret listened as the procedural language unfolded, familiar and precise. Dates entered into record, jurisdictions acknowledged, scope defined. It was only when her name was spoken that the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if everyone inhaled at once. Margaret leaned forward, hands folded, eyes level. She did not smile. She did not brace. She simply existed in the moment she had spent her life preparing for. She spoke slowly, not because she needed to, but because she wanted every word to land exactly where it belonged. She explained how compliance systems eroded not through malice, but through convenience. How small exceptions, granted to people who seemed trustworthy, accumulated until the rule itself became optional. She described the architecture of Aerolink, not as a safeguard designed to punish, but as one built to interrupt momentum when momentum became dangerous. She did not mention the flight by name. She did not mention Grant Holloway at all. She did not need to. The record already held that story. Her focus stayed where it belonged, on pattern, on risk, on the quiet moments when someone could have stopped and chose not to. When questions came, they were sharper than she expected, but not hostile. Lawmakers pressed her on thresholds, on proportionality, on the economic impact of grounding operations. Margaret answered each one without defensiveness. She spoke of cost, yes, but also of loss, of how history measured the price of inaction far more harshly than delay. She reminded them that every regulation written in blood began as an inconvenience someone thought they could manage around. In the gallery, observers leaned forward. Some took notes. Others simply watched, recognition dawning slowly. This was not a woman seeking attention. This was a woman closing a loop. By the time the session adjourned, the cameras were live, the red lights glowing steadily now, and Margaret stepped out into a hallway thick with voices calling her name. She did not stop. She did not need to. Her statement was already in the record, where it would outlast any headline. Outside, late afternoon light washed the steps of the building in gold, and for a moment she paused, letting the sun warm her face. She thought of the plane, still grounded hours after it should have been airborne, and of the hundreds of passengers who would remember that day not for where they went, but for why they didn't. She thought of the engineers who would comb through logs with renewed seriousness, of the supervisors who would hesitate before approving shortcuts, of the quiet shift that would ripple outward long after the cameras moved on. Across the country, Grant Holloway sat alone in his office, the television muted, captions scrolling beneath Margaret's image as she spoke. He watched without sound, reading her words stripped of tone, stripped of context, reduced to text he could not interrupt. His phone lay face down beside him, unanswered. He felt smaller than he ever had, not because he had lost power, but because he understood, finally, how fragile it had always been. In a different city, Karen Whitmore sat at her kitchen table, a stack of training manuals open in front of her, highlighter uncapped. She paused the footage on her laptop, rewound, listened again. This time she heard what she had missed before. Not accusation. Responsibility. She picked up the pen and kept going. Weeks later, the flight would be rescheduled, the route restored, the system updated. The incident folded into a report with a title too long for memory and an appendix few would read. But something fundamental would have shifted. A line redrawn, a habit broken. Margaret returned home that night, tired in a way that sleep alone could not fix, but steady. She placed her bag by the door, loosened her shoes, and sat by the window as evening settled in. Somewhere overhead a plane passed, its lights blinking in measured rhythm, moving forward because countless unseen checks had aligned to allow it. She watched until it disappeared into the dark. The world would call her many things in the days to come. Disruptor, idealist, problem, hero. She had learned long ago not to argue with labels. They belonged to people who needed shortcuts to understanding. What mattered was simpler. A system had been forced to stop. A question had been asked. And once asked, it would echo. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more stories that matter, and comment below with 3 words.